Since the battering that 3rd Fleet had taken at the hands of Typhoon Cobra, command had changed and 3rd Fleet had become 5th Fleet under Admiral Spruance. A number of Typhoons had come and gone, and the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns had been fought. Now, Halsey was back in late May 1945, so 5th Fleet was once more 3rd Fleet. As far as weather tracking and prediction was concerned, much had changed and much had stayed the same. Many new weather stations had been brought online, and Guam now featured a Fleet Weather Central Station. And there were more long-range weather recon flights under US command, if not strictly reporting directly to 3rd Fleet. But as mentioned, other things were still very much the same. Despite the results of the previous inquiry, Commander Cosco was still on Halsey's staff as his senior aerologist, or weatherman, and the labyrinthine process of taking reports from various stations and aircraft, agreeing what they actually meant, and then funneling them up and down the chain of command for distribution back to fleet level, could scarcely have been less fraught if there was an actual Minotaur running around the halls of the Fleet Weather Central Station. It also seemed that fate did indeed have a sense of irony. For mere days after Halsey had resumed command, reports began to come in of a disturbance in the force of nature, that is, in the Philippine Sea. Much like in the run-up to Typhoon Cobra, the storm was at his back, and increasing swarms of kamikazes were to his front. This new weather system had some differences to Cobra, though. Whereas the previous Typhoon had been a vast, steadily marching wall of nature's fury, this one was smaller, faster moving, and concentrated the immense power of its storm system into a viciously concerted onslaught. It was also tracking in as if some spiteful power had granted it a homing system. Whereas Cobra had simply rolled in steadily from the southeast, this new storm, codenamed Connie, but sometimes also called Viper, started out heading west, and then gently turned north, as most Typhoons did, but would then begin to curve back on itself and head northeast. This would present a catch-22 situation. As the storm tracked in on 3rd Fleet from the southwest instead of the southeast, it meant that in theory the fleet could make a break for the deep ocean. But if Halsey left it a little too late, the worst aspect of the storm, the south to southeast side, would run right over his ships. Whereas if he headed into the teeth of Japanese air opposition, then even if caught by the edges of the storm, it would at least be the gentler side of it, for a given value thereof. And of course, he could break away from his station considerably earlier and dodge the weather system entirely, but that all reflects what could have been done, knowing what we know now. Whereas back at the start of June, Connie, or Viper, was a mere tropical disturbance at the start of its run, and Commander Cosco appears to have largely written it off as irrelevant compared to analysing the more immediate weather patterns nearby, which would help him time the launch of airstrikes. But as the first few days of June progressed, more and more scattered reports of the storm's growing intensity began to arrive. Some even from the intelligence department, who'd intercepted Japanese internal weather reports coming from various holdouts and bypassed islands. But the glacial speed of weather information relay meant that the individual reports were arriving somewhat out of order, and Cosco appears to have again not bothered to spend the time to reorder them into a more coherent picture. In fact, when the Central Weather Station on Guam decided to issue a typhoon warning on the 3rd or 4th of June, sources vary, likely due to time zone issues, he duly reported its arrival at a staff briefing, but then immediately asserted that this warning was wrong, since the curve back heading northeast of the typhoon didn't fit with established weather patterns. He seems not to have remembered that Typhoon Cobra hadn't exactly been following standard weather patterns either. But this didn't go unremarked. Other officers, perhaps those with a somewhat better survival instinct, or maybe just memories that were longer than the average goldfish, argued that they shouldn't really be taking such a risk again. Halsey, having listened to all the arguments, decided to try and avoid the storm. At least this time the fleet was actually refueling well ahead of time, and the last lines were being cast off even as the meeting was progressing, in part thanks to the rising seas. and so the fleet headed east-southeast to get out of the way of what Costco thought was the most likely track of the storm. Halsey also ordered any US Navy ships in the area to make regular reports on what the weather was doing where they were. But now came a point where Halsey would no doubt regret retaining the services of Commander Costco. Later in the afternoon, Guam sent out another report, now indicating that there were 2 storms, one of which was tracking north, and the other, at the time of the report being issued, was tracking north-northeast, but the 2 were on somewhat diverging courses. To Costco, this seemed to confirm his suspicions that the whole thing was overblown. After all, how could one storm suddenly become 2? Surely the whole thing was just massively overstated by rear echelon units who didn't really know what was going on. As the fleet entered calmer seas, Task Group 38.1 even managed to complete the interrupted refueling efforts. But, as normal, reality does not really care for the preconceptions of man, and the Typhoon had, in fact, split itself into 2 distinct systems. The one that was heading north was weaker and would eventually blow itself out, but the more easterly one was curving hard through north-northeast and then onto a much tighter northeast course, and at some points even heading almost directly east. At about the same time, the amphibious command ship USS Ancon was about 200 miles away from the fleet and heading for the Philippines. Then, on her radar, she spotted an extremely powerful and compact Typhoon barreling along at speed. Indeed, it was only 100 miles from the fleet. In keeping with Halsey's orders, she radioed in the urgent report, but now another factor came in to bite Third Fleet. Standing orders required all communication to be encrypted, and so Ancon's crew had to formulate the weather report, which they had fairly extensive data for thanks to the multiplicity of systems aboard the ship, encode said report, and then transmit it. Then at the other end somebody had to receive it, and then it went into a pile to be decoded, and only once it had been decoded could it actually be read. By the time all this had happened, it was almost midnight. If it had been daylight at this stage, Halsey could have confirmed the report simply by looking out the window at the horizon. With mere hours left until the storm was going to overtake them, Halsey called up his staff and senior officers. Admiral McCain suggested maintaining a course of 110 degrees and possibly speeding up. Costco, on the other hand, now advocated turning almost completely around onto a course of 300 degrees, back the way they'd come. After some deliberation, Halsey decided to go with Costco's recommendation. Rear Admiral Connie, one of Halsey's senior staffers, disagreed with that call, as indeed did most of the other senior officers, with Connie remarking with dripping sarcasm, "Someday we're going to maneuver blindly right into a typhoon." As it turned out, someday would be the next day. At this stage, the Fast Carrier Task Force had 3 task groups sailing roughly in company. Task Group 38.4 was the most northerly and contained the flagship of both Halsey and Admiral McCain. Task Group 38.1 was about 15 miles to the south of it, and Task Group 30.8, the replenishment group, was a little further still and roughly south-southeast of Task Group 38.4. At 02:30, the wind began to pick up almost as fast as the barometer began to drop. For many sailors aboard the fleet, there was a certain sense of, here we go again. The Typhoon in this case was extremely compact, only about 100 miles across, and as a result, Task Group 38.4 was actually largely spared its attentions outside of some rough seas. Task Group 38.1 and 30.8, on the other hand, would not be so lucky. The first to be hit was Admiral Beery's replenishment force, Task Group 30.8. At 02:30, the wind had been 35 knots constant, with gusts approaching 65. In the space of an hour, this soared to wind speeds reportedly in excess of 120 knots. I say in excess because a good chunk of the weather instrumentation that reported such speeds then promptly jumped several hundred feet into the air and dispersed themselves over a wide area, which was somewhat counterproductive to any further reporting. The seas rose like mountains, and the almost 50 ships in Task Group 30.8 all lost sight of each other as they braced as best they could for the next couple of hours of natural fury. The escort carrier USS Salamaua took a body blow that knocked out her steering, leaving her bobbing about amidst waves that overtopped not just the flight deck, but the bridge as well. Walls of solid water rolled over said flight deck, less breaking on the ship's bow and more just enveloping the vessel entirely. At one point, the bridge was pretty much the only part of the ship that wasn't underwater. The forward lookout platform, the walkway along the flight deck, a whole 40mm gun tub, and one of the aircraft handling booms all were ripped off and vanished into the sea. The flight deck's leading edge was bent up like some horrific cross between origami and modern art, and an Avenger broke free of its moorings and smashed up every other aircraft on deck, as well as running over and killing some poor brave sailor who tried to stop it. Only heroic work below, getting the steering back in action, saved the ship from being bowled over completely. Another escort carrier, the USS Windham Bay, had her hull split open in multiple locations, the leading 20 feet of her flight deck was pancaked down into the main hull, and aircraft both on deck and in the hangar broke free and ran amok. Although here her crew had slightly better luck than their compatriots. A complex ballet of chase and counter-chase as the ship plunged and reared resulted in no immediate fatalities. The aircraft elevator was hit repeatedly by breaking seas that forced it down against its will, resulting in water cascading into the hangar. So much water, in fact, came aboard that the carrier began to settle and barely responded to the rudder. But in the end, this proved to be an incredibly fortunate occurrence, as just enough water came in to weigh the ship down sufficiently to prevent the seas from simply pitching her on her beam ends, but it wasn't quite enough to just sink the ship outright by negating all buoyancy. And so, despite in the end resembling more of a monitor with aviation ambitions than an actual carrier, she managed to struggle on. Nearby, the destroyer escort USS Conklin was gamely doing her best when there was a very brief moment of silence, which was always a bad sign. This was followed immediately by a black wall of near-vertical water that smashed her in the face, a bit like a child running headlong into a shield wall made up of angry Roman legionnaires. As a result, Conklin was sent spinning off course and heeled over by 75 degrees to starboard. Men were swept off their feet as the forward bulkheads briefly became the new floors, before the starboard bulkheads snatched that honour away and the entire ship whirled around them. By all rights, she should have continued to capsize, but the Typhoon then decided to use the small ship as a punching bag. A series of rapid but still fairly large waves kicked her back up again a few degrees with their bases, before then smashing down on her with their crests and sending her still further over once again, a bit like a berserk fighter punching a downed opponent time and time again. Doors and hatches blew in, the radio room flooded, all external radio and radar gear was stripped away, and water cascaded down the ventilators into the engine rooms. There were several casualties here, as anything not bolted down was promptly lifted up and tossed through the machinery spaces at considerable speed. On the bridge, 3 men were washed clean off the ship. A moment later, another wave, coming from a completely different direction, returned one of them, the bridge talker, who was dumped roughly on the fantail, but the wave also took another man off the quarterdeck in exchange. A few hours later, one of the men from the bridge, a signalman, would be found drifting alone by another vessel, but the sailor from the quarterdeck and the officer of the deck from the bridge would never be seen again. At this point, the Conklin's fate seemed completely sealed, but she would then be saved by the same waves that were in the process of smashing her to pieces. She was still spinning from that initial blow, and this had ended up with her laying on her side with a superstructure pointed into the wind and the seas. One decently sized wave, and the sea would then pour down her funnel, and that would be that. But instead, another racing wall of water, like the first one, picked her up and hurled the whole ship bodily across the ocean, bringing her crashing down again, but also mostly righting her. Her much-battered crew heroically picked themselves up from the floor once again and managed to get the ship moving and under control, And so, although looking a bit more like a tin can that had gone 10 rounds with a baseball bat than a warship, Conklin struggled clear of the worst of the weather. To the rear of the refueling formation, the men of the oiler USS Millicoma had another problem. Since they'd just finished refueling hours earlier, all her booms were up, with the various lines and hoses still strung. This made her somewhat top-heavy, and so she began to roll crazily with every wave, while the crew tried, without success, to lower the booms. As they watched, 3 of these booms were twisted and bent over one after another by the wind and the seas. And then the foremast, which was supporting many of the booms, began to work itself back and forth, swaying more and more with every roll. Its base began to crack, and the mast began to come apart. If it fell, it would plunge right into tens of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel which was stored directly beneath it, and the sparks from that collision would no doubt send the ship skywards on a pillar of flame. Luckily for the ship, the wind began to die just as the last of the rigging and radio lines snapped, which allowed the crew to take emergency measures to stabilize the mast. Another destroyer escort, the USS Mitchell, wasn't subject to quite the same level of drama and damage. One sailor had earlier strung a hammock over one of her main drive motors, and the rising seas had lulled him to sleep. But mid-storm he woke up, looked down over the side of the hammock, and instead of seeing the big motor, he saw the bulkhead and the tool racks as the ship was heeling very heavily. Concluding that there was precious little he could safely do at that stage, he just held onto the hammock's sides and went back to sleep. Admiral Clark was in command of Task Group 38.1. This formation had spotted the oncoming storm at about 60 miles on radar, but almost immediately after that, one of the destroyers in his escort formation had lost steering control and he'd slowed up to ensure that the destroyer didn't get lost. Even as the leading edge of the Typhoon was enveloping the support group, he radioed ahead to Admirals Halsey and McCain to ask permission to change course and increase speed, as there was still time to avoid the worst of it. However, over in Task Group 38.4, they decided they didn't have enough detail to determine the storm's centre, seeming not to realise that the much closer Clark already did. So at first, they refused permission to manoeuvre independently on the basis of not having enough information. Clark then impressed upon them that they might not have the necessary information, but he definitely did. Rather unhelpfully, Task Group 38.4 then asked him to share that information with them instead of letting him act on it. An exasperated Clark forwarded the relevant radar information, and at 0440, almost an hour after Clark's initial request, permission was finally granted to change course at his discretion. But it was far too late, and the Typhoon was already upon them. Whereas in Cobra, the smaller ships had suffered most, this time it was the turn of the big ships, as the waves were so large that, assuming they managed to stay upright, the smaller ships were mostly just riding them up and down like elevators, while the bigger ships had just enough inertia to be more swept over rather than up. Even the battleships wouldn't come out of it fully intact. The Indiana had a fun time when a series of battering waves temporarily knocked out her steering and one of her engines. The Massachusetts took a host of minor damage from waves and what some suspected was flotsam from other ships being thrown at her, while one of her scout planes was claimed by a wave that rolled over the fantail like a massive grasping hand. Her ordeal in particular seemed initially to be quite short, until her sailors popped their heads out of various hatches to be treated to a small patch of clear sky, only to then realise they were quite literally in the eye of the storm, and everybody ducked back inside again as the winds grew almost as fast as they dropped. The 4 carriers in the task group, the Essex-class Bennington and Hornet and the Independence-class San Jacinto and Belleau Wood, were in for a bit of a rough ride. Bennington's reputation as a lucky ship ran out as the winds raced past the highest calibration of her instruments before a series of close-packed waves that overtopped her masts slammed into her in quick succession. The forward overhang of the flight deck was completely smashed in, another 35 feet of supported flight deck bent like a pretzel. The ship's catapults were turned into interesting studies in what happens if you drop a wet noodle onto a plate, and water poured into the forecastle deck, down passageways, and raced through the forward living quarters. Hornet had a similar experience. A marching series of 60-foot high waves sent the forward 25 feet of the flight deck plunging downwards, which would force Hornet to run flight operations off her stern in the coming days after the first attempted launch in the aftermath of the Typhoon sent a Hellcat spiralling into the sea when the vortex of air currents that had been thrown up by fallen decking knocked the poor fighter out of the sky right after it had gone airborne. Luckily, the ability to operate in reverse had actually been built into the Essex class, although until now there had been precious little cause to actually use it. The two light carriers, surprisingly, came out of the experience pretty well. San Jacinto had of course been badly battered by Cobra, but her captain had learned from that experience, and the two carriers thus pointed their bows to the seas and slowed down to steerage way only. As a result, the worst thing that happened to either of them, apart from minor damage here and there, was San Jacinto losing two aircraft, which had been deliberately positioned on the bow as windbreaks to protect the rest of them, as those particular aircraft were in non-flyable condition, even before the sea got hold of them. The crew would later give their opinion that this Typhoon had been much stronger, but of somewhat shorter duration, than Cobra. But the ship that suffered the worst was the cruiser USS Pittsburgh. Her captain had ordered her battened down as if going into combat, and that proved to be providential as around 0630 the executive officer showed up on the bridge to report that the hull was buckling about 100 feet aft of the bow. Moments later, a series of big waves came piling in. The first one was somewhat like a wall, and as it hit, the bridge crew saw the bow twist up by 90 degrees. And then, even as the spray was still falling away, another wave, this one much more like a storm surge, just picked up the whole cruiser. The bow fell, still attached by some upper deck plates, but found no support as the ship itself was briefly being suspended in mid-air by the crest of this big surging wave, holding the ship up amidships. And so the bow kept falling, tearing 104 feet of itself clean off the ship. Luckily, none of the crew were in the missing portion, but now the sea was threatening to use the bow as a club to smash up the rest of the heavy cruiser. Her captain thus ordered the ship to come about hard. This was a hugely risky maneuver, subjecting the Pittsburgh first to a beam seas and then to following seas that could wreck her steering, propulsion, or just hurl her about generally. But there were two good reasons for his actions. First, the looming shape of the bow was coming after them. Second, there was the fact that the only thing keeping the ship afloat at this point were some thin and now rather exposed bulkheads that were not designed for this. By turning away from the storm, the pressure on these bulkheads was lessened, buying time for damage control crews to shore them up. Somehow, the captain managed to accomplish all this while also in direct communication about the situation to Admiral Clark over voice radio. Once the initial shoring parties were underway, the ship turned once again to present her starboard beam to the seas, which was considered somewhat less risky after a series of high waves had rolled over the stern. Pittsburgh's sister ship Baltimore and the light cruiser Duluth also suffered bow damage, with their front ends twisting and rupturing, but fortunately not parting company from their parent ships. Later in the day, the fleet tug Muncie cheerfully reported have sighted a suburb of Pittsburgh and taken it in tow. Thanks to the destroyer Blue, which had spotted and followed the still afloat bow section, the tug was able to recover it and tow it home, showing up only a day behind the rest of the cruiser, the two parts of the ship eventually being reunited. As the storm cleared, the casualty list was much lower than it had been for Cobra. 6 dead, 4 badly wounded, somewhere between 75 and 100 aircraft gone, and almost the same number again badly damaged. But, thanks to the damage to the big ships, the overall effect on combat operations was actually somewhat greater than that of Cobra, especially since the Fast Carrier Task Force had been slowly bleeding carriers home with kamikaze damage over the past few months, and so with Bennington and Hornet temporarily out of action, it was a fairly serious dent in the Fast Carrier Task Force's operational capabilities. Unsurprisingly, another inquiry was ordered. The questions levelled this time were somewhat more pointed. Halsey and Costco claimed that most of the problems were due to a lack of information and the slow speed of transit of weather reports due to the need to encrypt and decrypt them. Halsey advocated for these reports to be moved to open-air unencrypted broadcasting and for there to be more aerial reconnaissance and storm tracking. But after just over a week of hearing all the testimony, the judge advocate of the inquiry laid out his opinion in quite scathing, if legalistic, terms. I believe it is my duty as judge advocate to advise the court officially in matters of law if there appears to be any doubt on questions of law. Whether or not the matter which I will discuss is doubtful, I don't know, but it is very important in my opinion. It is my opinion that the testimony that this court has heard contains sufficient material to make out a prima facie case of culpable inefficiency in the performance of duty on the part of the Commander 3rd Fleet. It is a type of thing which is made punishable by paragraph 9 of the 5th article for the government of the Navy, and is treated briefly in section 67 of Naval Courts and Boards. It is also my opinion that the record discloses that an act or omission by the Commander 3rd Fleet was the proximate cause of the disaster. In examining the facts and in employing the usual legalistic methods of fixing liability as between two persons or in finding a liability to the public in the part of any public servant, the law of causation indicates that the proximate or legal cause of damage to the 3rd Fleet on June 5th was the turning of the fleet to a course of 300 degrees at about 01:30 on June 5th. Any other inefficiencies, either subsequent or previous to that moment, any other pieces of negligence, either previous or subsequent to that event, may be contributory causes, but the outstanding and proximate cause, the legal cause, of the disaster was that change in course at a time when the officer who caused that change to be made had in his possession, or in the exercise of reasonable care should have had in his possession, sufficient information which, if properly and promptly evaluated, would have shown the danger involved. In the end, although the inquiry did agree that more aerial reconnaissance flights to monitor typhoons were needed and that weather communications should now be made in the clear rather than on encrypted channels, it also recommended that Halsey and McCain, the latter of whom was held largely responsible for the delay in authorising Admiral Clark to change course, be assigned to other duties. However, Nimitz declined to act on this, balancing Halsey's popularity and previous achievements along with the fact that he did have something of a point about the weather tracking and communication system being wholly inadequate. Admiral King grudgingly agreed with Nimitz's overall recommendations, although he did then arrange to have Admiral McCain relieved of command within a couple of months. Ostensibly, McCain would move to become the deputy head of the Veterans Administration, but in the end McCain died in September 1945, some said in part due to the blow of being made the semi-official scapegoat for the mistakes of many other officers. There was one bright spot to all this, though. As mentioned, the move to faster unencrypted weather communications and persuading the US Army Air Force to allow some of its B-29s to be used to track and monitor storm systems meant that weather tracking was much improved, and two further typhoons in August and September were mostly avoided by the Allied fleets, which was just as well since the September one was reported at its core to have the power of Viper but the duration and size of Cobra. And with that, it brings us to the end of the last of Halsey's Typhoons. There's an even more detailed account of Pittsburgh's struggle linked in the description below, and I hope to see you again soon.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.